Hey everybody, my name's Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director and founder of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy in Media, Pennsylvania. I'm board certified in sociometry, psychodrama, and group psychotherapy, and an expert in traumatic stress. I'm really excited that you found this video, and I hope that you find it helpful in your work. So this video is part of an ongoing video series to promote my newly published book, Social Work, Sociometry, and Psychodrama, Experiential Approaches for Group Therapists, Community Leaders, and Social Workers. And so previously I had mentioned Morene's developmental theory. So I want to introduce some of the basics of Morene's developmental theory now. There's three phases in Morene's developmental theory. And these three phases mirror the interventions that we use within a psychodrama session. The first phase is doubling, the second phase is the mirror, and the third phase is role reversal. So the double, the mirror, and the role reversal. So these are the three phases related to child development in Morene's perspective. Now the first phase, doubling, this is when actually, I'm going to start even a little bit earlier than that. If you remember earlier in the video or in a previous video, we talked about the first universe and the second universe. And so Moreno believed that when a child is born, that they're emerging from the first universe into the second universe of forms. And that they're in this state of oneness with all things. Moreno called it the matrix of identity. That they don't experience themselves as separate from their mother, from their caregivers, or from anyone or anything. They're still integrated with the first universe and kind of plunged into the second universe. And so the first phase of child development is doubling. And this is where the caregivers are helping the child consciously and unconsciously. I think a lot of it happens instinctually, helping the child to label their experience, helping a child who doesn't have language yet, can't articulate what they're experiencing, what they want, what they feel, their sensations. So the caregivers are doubling them and helping them to do that for them. And in doing so, helping them stabilize within the second universe, helping them to accurately label their experience, helping them to begin to establish a sense of self through doubling. The second phase of Morenean developmental theory is the mirroring. And this is the stage of development where the child begins to develop a sense of self to the point where they can see themselves in a mirror and recognize themselves. They start to differentiate from their parents and from others, no longer in this matrix of identity. And so what we often see, especially in trauma work, is clients who've experienced developmental trauma, childhood trauma, abandonment, neglect, complex trauma. These are often examples of inaccurate doubling and mirroring from caregivers, or simply a lack of or an absence of doubles and mirrors. And so without adequate doubling and mirroring in the early stages of one's life, instead of developing a healthy sense of individualism, a healthy sense of self, the ability to label and articulate one's experience, internal experience, to understand one's feelings and cravings and desires and sensations, there's a misattunement to self that emerges from a misattunement from the caregivers. And so this is often what we're encountering, what trauma survivors are experiencing. And so we might think of, as psychodramatists, how we can be clinically informed by the developmental theory as it relates to the types of trauma, abandonment, and neglect our protagonists or clients have experienced. When we're working with a client who never received adequate doubling from their caregivers growing up, we might intentionally create opportunities for more doubling throughout the group. And this might be really corrective and reparative for the client. It may help them further establish a sense of self, help them be attuned to what they want, what they feel, what they experience. The doubling might be really corrective in that way. In the same way, mirroring could be really helpful. In the psychodrama process, the mirror intervention is when we ask the client to step out of the scene. Someone else steps in the scene for them and then replays that scene so the client can see it from a distance, almost like they're looking at a mirror of themselves in action. So this mirror intervention can be really useful when a client is really stuck, struggling with self-awareness, or just oblivious to how their actions, their behavior is experienced by others. Or it can be helpful for integrating positive change, helping them to see it from the third-hand perspective, third person, rather than being in the middle of it in the first person. So doubling and mirroring are the first two phases. And doubling, there's different types of doubling, which we're not going to get into all of that in this video. The role of the double, the way it was originally developed and the way that both Zerka and J.L. Moreno primarily used it, was that the double was a role that stayed with the protagonist throughout the entire psychodrama. And so the double was attuned to the protagonist, helping to verbally articulate things that may be unspoken for the protagonist in the moment. If the protagonist relates to whatever the double says, they would repeat it in their own words. And if whatever the double says doesn't fit for them, they would just change it to correct it. And so it's really an opportunity to get clear about what one's experience is, or to speak one's truth. Now, in more modern psychodrama practice, while some practitioners do use the type of doubling that the Morenos used, psychodramatists seem to primarily use what we'll call hit-and-run doubling, where the director or an auxiliary role or an audience member will come and offer just one sentence of doubling for the protagonist and then go sit down, rather than the double being a stable, consistent role throughout the entire process. Now, the therapeutic spiral model of psychodrama has in some ways adapted the original role of the double into what they call the containing double or the body double, specifically for trauma survivors, helping to balance expression with containment, which are important clinical functions for healing trauma in a safe way, or helping to ground a protagonist within their body. So there's lots of different types of doubles. And so the third phase of Moreno's developmental theory is the phase of the role reversal. And developmentally speaking, this is when the child progresses to being able to not only have their own sense of self, their own identity separate from others, but to see and realize and understand that everybody else is their own person as well, with their own feelings, their own perspectives, their own self, their own experience. And so in the role reversal phase, the child can then imagine what somebody else might be experiencing. Of course, in psychodrama practice, in terms of psychodrama intervention, the role reversal intervention is when we ask a client to switch roles with another role in the scene and become that person, become that element, become that role, and to see themselves from that role and speak to themselves from that role. So these are the three phases in Morena's developmental theory. There's an article where Zerka expands on these three phases, integrating them with Erikson's psychosocial stages, looking beyond just child development, where I believe she creates 8 stages throughout the entire lifespan, exploring both doubling, mirroring, role reversal in childhood, but also throughout the lifespan, and in particular in relationship to one's caregivers. How developmentally, as the parent and caregivers age, the adult child often becomes a double, a mirror, and is role reversing for their aging parent. As the parent prepares for their transition out of this universe, and in Morenean philosophy, back to the first universe. And so it's a full circle in the way Zerka outlines it. And you can find this short article in the book, The Quintessential Zerka. The Quintessential Zerka. So there's a lot more that we could say about Morena's developmental theory, and these three phases are used within a specific psychodrama intervention, a process called the social microscope, which is one of the core interventions of Sociometry, and perhaps we'll cover that in another video. But this is the foundation of Morena's developmental theory.